I'm Maura McDonough, here with Brenna Gautam. Together, we're co-directors of the Hoya Writing Collective. You're listening to an episode of The Right Stuff, where we interview writers in the Georgetown community about their writing journeys and their advice for aspiring authors. Today, we're speaking with Hollis Kurman, a Georgetown SFS alum who built a career as a management consultant before pivoting to becoming a published poet and award-winning children's book author. Her debut book, Counting Kindness, has been published in 10 countries and 7 languages, endorsed by Amnesty International, and nominated for the Kate Greenaway Medal. A student of poets Sharon Old and Daniel Hoffman, Hollis published her debut poetry book, Unlikely Skylight, in 2025 through Bear Street Books. In the Netherlands, she runs a literary salon for alumni of Georgetown and other leading universities, which we'll get into today. So as I mentioned, you have a background in consulting. You came up through McKinsey and founded your own consultancy while publishing poetry in literary journals. You also published 2 children's books in 2020 and 2023. So after building this successful consulting career, when did you first start thinking of yourself as a writer?
Yeah, that's always such a tricky question. I think it's particularly fraught for me. My sort of backstory and road to becoming a writer is a very long and winding one. So, as you mentioned, I had published a lot of poems in literary journals along the way and, did readings when I could, took part in open mics and poetry slams and all the rest of it. But I pretty quickly realized that combining that writing life with the international consulting life, working 60 to 80 or even more hours a week, I was often flying to multiple countries every week. It was just really hard to combine. At a certain point when you mentioned my own consulting firm, I had this great goal of doing a sort of 80-20, where not only me, but anyone who worked for me had the opportunity to take 20% of their time for some other project or passion. And for me, that was writing. And at the beginning, I was super disciplined. My Fridays were writing days, but then work snuck in and then children snuck in. And before I knew it, writing was on the back burner again. And I remember at a certain point wrestling with this and seeing this great cartoon in the New Yorker. It was like a gravestone with the guy's name and dates saying, never did get around to finishing that novel. And that really stuck with me. I remember calling my father and saying, Dad, yeah, something's got to give. And oddly, in part, I have to credit my concussion 12 years ago, having a traumatic brain injury, so just forces you to shift gear and reassess your priorities. So that was part of it. And I started joining writers groups and, we can talk about some of that later. But, the question at what point, I always felt like I didn't dare call myself a writer or a poet. I remember writing a piece for the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators thinking I've kind of always been a writer, but now I'm an author. And that just felt different. But even then, I think calling yourself a writer feels like a big thing. It's, do I dare say that? Who deserves or who has earned the right to say that and a poet? But it's a big moment when you can, for sure.
Did you study poetry and writing, or was this just something you had always loved?
Yes and no. I always loved poetry. I always loved writing and writing poetry. I just did a talk recently on the power of poetry and had an E. E. Cummings poem that I shared with the group that my mom used to read to us when we were little. So I always grew up loving it and writing it. I didn't study it officially, but I always kind of studied it in between. When I was an undergrad at Penn, one of my favorite classes, it was a really special workshop. I was a freshman and invited to take it by Daniel Hoffman, who, was a big, big deal. And they were all upperclassmen. And that was, I think, my first introduction to writing at that level, that kind of demand. And then later doing workshops, like with Sharon Olds at the Southampton Writers Conference. And wherever I could, I would sneak it in. But, it was not that I did an undergraduate degree in creative writing or an MFA.
Yeah, I think that's something we definitely want to talk to you about a little bit is so many people are familiar with writers in the kind of MFA to book deal pipeline. But what we see so much more with people we talk to and just real life examples is people usually have to build this career and, as you said, kind of sneak writing in and then sort of sticking with it over time, over the years. That's how they build their writing life. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you is because you've done it in such an interesting way, building your writing life, building your community.
Yeah, so there's a group here in the Netherlands that I've been chairing for many years called the Ivy Circle. And it's kind of a consortium of the alumni clubs of the top, maybe, 20 or so of the top universities in the US, including Georgetown. I think Georgetown's our most recent member. We have all kinds of partnerships with other organizations, and one of those is the American Book Center. So I had been, which by the way, anyone who comes to Amsterdam, you must go visit the American Book Center. It's an amazing place. Um, I had been participating in their open mic nights, their open mics for a really long time and just loved them. And at a certain point, I approached the owner and I said, what if we did like a private open mic night for the Ivy Circle? There are a lot of us who are writers or creators or performers, and why don't we get everyone together? So we did, and it was a big success, great turnout. Everyone loved it. And after that, Erin Lang, who is a young Georgetown alum living here in the Netherlands, she approached me. She said, we got to keep this going. What if we made a sort of book panel dinner, was what she was calling it. And we got together and tried to figure out, well, what would be a good format? Does it have to be only for writers or not? And we decided that we'd keep it small and intimate, but keep the bar low. So, it is morphed into, it's one of our most popular initiatives. We rebranded it the Algonquin Group. It started in a restaurant, but now it's always a potluck dinner hosted by someone at home. So we cap it at 15 or 16 people. And it's a mix of successful published writers, wannabe writers, and just writer adjacent, people who are lovers of the spoken and written word. And we created this format that just works. And I encourage everyone to copy it, which is you have the opportunity, everyone has the opportunity, not the obligation to read something. It could be something that you've written, could be something, if you are a writer, that you've published or not yet that you're working on, or something that you didn't even write, but that just inspired you. Everyone gets 5 minutes to read. And then there's 10 minutes of intense discussion, and it gets intense really quickly. And that could be a mix of, kind of positive, constructive feedback or suggestions or connections. There's a guy in the group who has all kinds of Amazon publishing businesses, and he's been really interesting for those who are doing the self-publishing circuit, for example, or introductions, or sometimes it just gets super philosophical. We've had people move to tears. We've had people say, I've been looking for something like this for years. And it's a really eclectic mix of cultures, nationalities, ages, genres. We've got everyone, the only children's book writer, poets, screenwriters, uh, essayists, anything. And it's wonderful. And it's something that it sells out immediately. We put it out in the newsletter and it's done. We have a chat group. And so within that community, we also keep each other up to speed about other writing related things going on in the community. So it just kind of helps grow.
It sounds amazing. And one thing I wanted to kind of pick up there, when you talked about the diversity of the group and the connections within the group. You're someone who has written poetry, has written children's literature. You're working on a memoir. How has that kind of played out within the Algonquin group, but also maybe how has it influenced you?
Yeah. cross-genre is a mixed blessing, I would say, and then let me start with that, and then I can share some further thoughts about creating a community. So I complicate things for myself, not only being by, cross-genre, but even multiple styles within each genre. So what are the benefits of going cross-genre? For sure, it's working all the different muscle groups, as a writer, kind of like if you're doing abdominal muscles and your obliques, whatever, like, so it's definitely working those writers' muscles in different ways. It helps cross-fertilize, both in terms of craft and in terms of community. I'm someone who also thrives on variety, so you can never get bored. Like, you're kind of not in the mood for that particular project or genre, you can just move to the other one. So there's that as well. And I think, personally, I think that being a poet helps your writing in every way, no matter what you're writing, whether it's business writing, fiction, nonfiction, theater, screenplays, just the economy and beauty of language, the sound of it in poetry crosses over to everything. There are disadvantages to being multi-genre, and probably the biggest one is the risk of diluting your author's brand, and we can pretend that that's not important, but it does matter. Like, what are you, I remember at the Southampton Writers Workshop, I asked Billy Collins once, I said, because he's of course Billy Collins, I said, did it ever occur to you to write or publish things that were not the brilliant, humoristic, but moving poems, then he said, no, this works for me. And I remember thinking, sure does. I wish, first of all, I had that talent, but also I wish I had that, mono focus in my genre and style. I think there's another potential disadvantage, which is a shame because it should be an advantage in my view, which is sometimes I feel it's harder to get an agent that way. You're not as easy to pigeonhole and put on one part of the shelf. And then lastly, I think also erroneously, serious people involved with children's literature know that picture books are actually the hardest to write and often the hardest to get published, but they look like the easiest. And so people who don't really know children's literature would think, well, how could a serious poet be someone who also writes children's books? Whereas for me, they're both about having to do so much with so little, being so spare, having every word do triple duty and sound good on top of it. So for me, it felt like an unusual but a natural fit. I don't know if you want me to talk a little bit about the community part. I think community, most writers probably tell you how important community is. There are a bunch of reasons for that. So for some, it might be the networking. For most, it's probably also just to have some sense of togetherness. This is a very isolated and isolating vocation. And I think some people love that, people who love being on their own, but particularly someone like me coming from a world of teams and working together all the time, it's a moment to sit down and just shut yourself off. But there's also the beauty of being able to combine community with craft, right? And then that's for me the sweet spot. How can we connect with one another at the same time that we're developing ourselves and helping support and develop others? And there's this whole ecosystem out there. Of course, it's the writers groups and the conferences and the residencies and the beta readers and, the critique partners and all of that. But it's also the bookstores, it's the libraries, and they in turn have all kinds of activities and groups to get involved in. And I find the more you give back to them, you can actually grow in that community. I talked about the American Book Center. They have these writers' nights. They love when I come in and fill a room and do something. The American Library in Paris, I'm now in my third year of being in the jury for their Young Writers Fiction Festival, which is just wonderful. These are young writers 8 to 18 and giving them that kind of platform and support and exposure, but also just get into it from all the different doors. I moderate a lot of literary events as well. So, I just had the thrill of moderating a huge event with U.S. Poet Laureate Ada Limon, super inspiring event with other poets, but also big fiction writers like Jennifer Egan and Michael Chabon and Jonathan Safran Foer. And every time you do one of these events, it's another opportunity to dig in and analyze and really get into the nuts and bolts of that writing. So all of these things are just sort of adjacent, and they all build on one another and add a rewarding little piece.
Yeah, my question is just thinking about this. Would you consider yourself an outgoing person? Because I think I'm thinking of somebody hearing this
Yeah.
and like the issue is kind of that first step. It makes sense to me that the opportunity snowball when you get going, because that's kind of the same thing that happened with me and Brenna with the Hoya Writing Collective. You kind of start small, you start intimate,
Right.
things grow. That's how we got connected. But so what would you say? How did you take that first step? Were you shy or was it just easy for you?
I'm not shy, so I am an outgoing person. I wouldn't, but Erin, I'm just going to be listening to this. Erin, who co-started the Algonquin Group with me, she's definitely much more of an introvert. She's a powerhouse, but she's so humble and I think hesitates to put her out there. So I would say combining doing this together, like somebody who might not be as naturally inclined to getting out there and making connections and standing in front of large crowds with someone who does do that more naturally, or enjoy doing it. But you nailed it. It's start small. I think we tend to intimidate ourselves by thinking that everything has to suddenly be, formal and perfect and tick all the boxes. Um, I think especially women, I'm sorry to say that, but I think it's especially women who tend to think, oh, I have to have everything perfect and tick every box. But start small, do something informal. Sometimes amazing things start with a group of 3, 2, and then you start building on that. And I think the other key step is, instead of thinking, what can this do for me? Think about, what can this do for others? It's more rewarding. I think it's more effective. And for those who are less keen to put themselves out there, it's a much easier way in.
Yeah, it sounds less intimidating too. I mean, a lot of the things you've talked about, I'm so impressed with kind of this idea of being really open, low barrier to entry. Like it doesn't have to be the most formal event. It can just be a slam night or an open mic or yeah, with Maura, thankfully I've built in a partner, so I don't have to be shy. But yeah, it's always good to like have that one other person or small community even if you
Yeah,
don't have
and
a
that
big
balance, not everybody has to have the same profile or do things the same way. So that's fine. Just play to your strengths, I would say. I think that's a good thing in life as well as in doing something like this. So if you're good at quiet connections behind the scenes, that'll be your thing. If you're good in small group things, make that your thing. If you love being on stage in front of 200 people, then find the stage, or build it.
I think with that, since we're on the topic of advice for aspiring writers, it would be a good point to move on to the lightning round. So one of
Sure.
the questions is, what is one piece of advice you would give to someone just starting out as a writer?
I think my absolute biggest advice is, don't give up. Don't give up. Being a writer is a marathon. It's not a sprint. I think a lot of people get into it thinking it's a sprint. It's not. It's hard. Every part of it is hard, if we're honest, right? So finding the time, making the time to sit down and write is hard. Writing itself is hard. Editing is hard. Getting published is hard. Marketing and selling your book even after it's published is hard, but it's, of course, all so rewarding. Why else would we do it? It's not because we're getting rich doing it, right? So, maybe J.K. Rowling, but the rest of us are not doing it for that reason. And you might want to, take a break or give up on a particular project or a poem or a story or put it in a drawer or come back to it later. But giving up as a writer, it's like the Michael Jordan, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? And I think also it's never too late. My mom just published her first book at the age of 86. 2 years ago, to lyrical reviews. She's been writing personal essays a long time. So I think, wow, it's not too late. It's a good thing she didn't give up. Um, so I think that's the biggest piece of advice. I remember coming out of one of my first children's book workshops was the Highlights Foundation in the Poconos in Pennsylvania, like the magazine. And I was sharing a ride back to New York City with the main instructor. And I asked him, I said, be honest with me, how many of the writers coming through this program end up publishing books? And he said, not a lot, but it's mostly because they give up. And then later, fast forward to a couple of years later, and I had published my first book, I think just my first book. I contacted him and I said, you know what? I didn't give up. And the book is out, and I'd love some help with, editing and next career steps, etc. So don't give up.
That is great advice. Don't give up. What is one book or resource that influenced your approach as a writer?
This is an unfair question, which is your right to ask. I think probably more than even a book, it's a passage that I read as a student in a nonfiction piece that Thomas Mann, the German novelist, had written, which is, if you ever get stuck, just if you can write one true thing, you can get started. And you can come back and change it later. Although I have found cases where I've come back and it was just unexpectedly perfect. So yeah, that was kind of a passage. But there are also there are books on writing and writing life, which I'd also recommend just quickly. One is called Still Writing by Dani Shapiro, and I think just it's for she writes, I think, the perils and pressures of a creative life, which is a lovely, excellent read. And then in a totally different vein, husband gave me a book called First You Write a Sentence, which is a lot more entertaining than it sounds. And one of the key takeaways that I found, and I think this is anyone who writes anything should get this book. And one of my favorite takeaways was be kind to your readers, be generous to your readers. And I think that's such a good, reminder for all of us who write, no matter what we're writing. Don't get all caught up in your own thing. Think about your reader.
What's one way Georgetown has influenced your path as a writer?
Yeah, Georgetown probably influenced me differently from some of your other writers because I was there to do my MSFS, so my master's at the School of Foreign Service, which I loved. And I would say probably the most direct way is that it really taught me to think about the world deeply and from so many different angles and see patterns that you otherwise wouldn't see. And all of that ends up in my writing, in my poetry, in my children's books, in my blog posts, everything from human rights and refugees and immigration issues to conflict and war to climate crisis. It was all there at Georgetown, and it's all in my writing still. And of course, even though I was not studying creative writing and literature the way I had as an undergrad at Penn, the level expected of anything you write and turn in at Georgetown from those amazing professors of course, is perfect. And I have to have a special shout out to Madeline Albright, who was my professor and mentor when I was there. And she has a special passion for seeing women achieve everything. Um, and she was just so inspiring. And I love her books too. So, yeah.
So that brings us to the last question is what are you working on now and where can people find you?
So the big elephant in the room for me is the concussion memoir, which I am working on. And I'm still drafting it. So it's not out there yet, but we hope that it will get out there because I think that if this book can help even just one person avoid what happened to me, whether it be with a traumatic brain injury or anything else chronic or hard or painful, or the people around them or the practitioners helping them, it will be worth everything. I'm very excited about this book. And I'm writing it in memoir format, but I'm also still writing and publishing and working on more poetry and more children's books. There's another book coming out in my counting book series, so that's being worked on as we speak, and all of it will end up on my website. So it's just holliskurman.com. Very easy to find and to remember, holliskurman.com, or a lot of it shows up in my writer's Instagram as well, and that's just holliskurman_writer. So I don't post everything there, but everything ends up on the website somehow in any case. And maybe it will be an event coming soon to a town near you, or, love to do another Georgetown thing.
Well, we'd love to have you in DC if you ever want to come our way. Although I think we'll both take the excuse to go to Amsterdam, so
Yeah,
maybe we'll visit you.
yeah, that sounds so lovely.
Honestly, if you come, we'll have a whole special Algonquin session just for that. We'll get everyone together. We'll bring you over to the American Bookstore. I totally see it. But I do need to get back to DC because it has been years.
Until then, well, thank you so much, Hollis, for coming on and speaking with us.
Well, thank you both. And I love doing this. Good luck to everybody, and especially to all the aspiring writers out there. We've all got your back.